I was talking about Francis Wilson's early work on black miners' wages. These findings helped to build his reputation as a preeminent economics researcher of his time. But this was really the beginning of a long and a distinguished career as an advocate for South Africans who were trapped in poverty, and also as an academic with a finely tuned social conscience. His work on migrant labor included studies of informal settlements in Cape Town, and also the destructive consequences of the pass laws on family lives and on the social fabric as a whole. In no other economy in the world, he wrote, as so large a proportion of the labor force stayed in single-sex accommodation and worked at a place where their families were unable by law to stay with them, unquote. In his later work, Francis argued for a sovereign wealth fund for the Southern African region to deal with, as he put it, unfinished business in the countries that had acted as labor reserves. Francis Wilson founded SALDRU, the Southern African Labor and Development Research Unit, in 1975. Its objective was to conduct applied empirical research and capacity building that focuses on poverty and inequality, labor markets, human capital, and on social policy. SALDRU's reputation for groundbreaking work, pursued with rigor, led to a commission by the World Bank to undertake the country's first living standards measurement study for South Africa in 1993. So this was an important time at which to undertake such a study. The social fabric of South Africa that awaited the first democratic government a year later was in complete tatters, as became clearer from the study. And thus began a series of panel surveys to establish a baseline of living conditions at the start of our democratic era, a major contribution. I should say that through this project, Francis worked closely with our speaker this evening, Sir Angus Deaton. In 2001, Francis founded DataFirst, which provides open access to data from South Africa and other countries on the continent. More recently, he assisted the government with strategies to ease the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the poor. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've given just a sketch of the considerable body of work by Francis Wilson during an active and a distinguished career, energetically pursued and with his trademark warmth, combined with razor-sharp intellect and a good dose of pragmatism. This work he dedicated to those who have had and have no economic power in this country. Just after he received an honorary doctorate from UCT in 2016, to mark his more than 30 years of teaching and scholarship in the School of Economics, Francis called for, and I'm quoting again, he called for a radical creative vision beyond the gods that have failed both on the left and on the right. What is needed are hearts on fire and heads on us, unquote. Through his work within UCT and beyond the university, and through the departments and structures that he helped to develop or to influence, Francis Wilson planted a spirit of service that we are seeking to nurture through this annual lecture. His reputation encompasses not just his accomplishments as a scholar, but also his qualities as a teacher, a leader, and a mentor. So I hope I've given you an idea of why we honor his memory through this very special lecture series, which provides an opportunity to explore the ways that economic science can promote social justice and equitable policy. And with that, dear colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, I will hand over to Professor Murray Leibrand, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. good evening, and allow me just to welcome you warmly to this this wonderful day in the life of SALDRU, and welcome to you, Lindy, too. It's wonderful to have you as integral to our program. And Daya, thank you for the support of the University of Cape Town, and thank you for that wonderful introduction to Francis. As Daya was saying, when Francis left to establish DataFirst in 2001, well, he didn't leave, right? He retired many times in various ways, but he fortunately for us, great blessing, he never left SALDRU. So he stayed around, he inspired us, he advised us all the way through to the end, really. He packed up his office in 2018. That too wasn't a retirement. It was just another one of the passages along the way. As Professor Reddy was saying, you know, Francis pushed us all the way. He was proud of us, and he was proud that we tried to take on the mantle of the Francis Wilson mantle and take it forward. And he pushed us all the way to make sure that we actually took our work seriously enough to push it into the space of having an impact on our society for good, and actually pushing ourselves on what we thought the implications were. He was an activist, and he pushed us to be that way too, which makes the topic of tonight's lecture by Sir Angus Deaton. I won't call you Sir again, Angus, if you don't mind. I'll call you Professor Deaton. Very, very important. And you know, Professor Deaton will talk to his association with Francis, in particular, in the course of his lecture. He has had profound influence on many of us in SALDRU. Certainly on Martin and on myself and on Kelly Ardington directly in inspiring us. When I was in graduate school, stumbling through a lot of mathematics, suddenly, serendipitously, a book called Economics and Consumer Behavior by Angus Deaton and John Muehlbauer was part of my microeconomics syllabus. And it was life-changing, because in the section of the book, there was a rigorous discussion of household welfare and social welfare and inequality that meshed the world of microeconomics to the world of the philosophies of justice and things that I'd held very, very dear, but thought were somehow completely separate from this. Microeconomics was a game. I knew I could do it, and I could do it quite well. And I was a lefty who could do microeconomics. But at that moment, it all changed considerably for me. And later on, when we were moving into the leadership of SALDRU, and I got given a copy of Angus's book on household surveys. And that too was a life-changing, and a number of us in SALDRU have clutched onto that book as a sacred text of ours, actually. And so when Angus was visiting in about 1999, I surmise, with Anne Case, he offered to come into my master's class on survey analysis and to engage with the students. And it was just wonderful. It was very lovely. We were teaching out of Angus's book, and I wasn't sure that the students completely understood who was with them in the room, but nonetheless, it was a friendly engagement, and further generations were inspired. So there's a resonance of the lecture with Francis Wilson, a perfect way to celebrate Francis. but there's also the resonance of the lecture with the SALDRU and the DataFirst and the cause that we've tried to forge together. And so it's such a privilege to welcome Angus Deaton to give the first Francis Wilson Memorial Lecture as the Professor of Economics and International Affairs Emeritus at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and the Economics Department. I think the emeritus means a Francis Wilson type of retirement, like it's a non-retirement really. And obviously Angus was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his analysis of consumption, poverty, and welfare. And so please, thank you, Angus, so much for delivering the lecture.
Thank you, Murray. That's a terrific introduction. I have no idea whether I can live up to it, but let me try. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm glad that's working. So let me talk a little bit to start about Francis, who was a very precious person to me. We first met in the early 1980s, more than 40 years ago. The Living Standards Measurement Study, the LSMS, had just started at the World Bank. Francis had written his book on migrant labor, about which we heard, central issue in South Africa, and went on to found SALDRU in 1975. Now, you might be surprised to see Francis's name along with that of Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara was president of the World Bank in 1980, in the early 80s, a well-meaning but somewhat tragic figure. And he was someone who really believed that technical solutions and measurement could solve political problems. Of course, it didn't work out that way in Vietnam, and hence the tragedy of the man. But when he came to the World Bank, he brought at least some of the same philosophy with him. And there's a famous speech in Nairobi in 1973 in which he puts poverty reduction at the center of the World Bank's mission, which it had not been there before. The LSMS followed because without data on surveys, you can't really say much about poverty. And so they were seen as measurement for development and for poverty reduction. And obviously, GDP is a very valuable tool, but you can't infer from GDP how people are doing or how people at the bottom are doing or how people anywhere are doing, just the average. And I think LSMS realized that measurement was necessary, but not sufficient for development, that you can't expect it to do everything. It says nothing about politics, for example. And Francis was very keen on the fact that non-measurement was non-recognition, and under apartheid, many were excluded. And so this documentation of the living standards of ordinary people was the first step to action, but only the first. And that takes us on to DataFirst. Francis had been involved, therefore, with LSMS from its very start. In 1989, he'd written a book with Mampela Rampale, the Carnegie Inquiry, called Uprooting Poverty. And the Project for Statistics on Living Standards and Development, or PSLSD, in 1993 was on the eve of majority rule. And for the very first time, everyone was covered. That was the key essential thing, not just a minority as previous statistics, whether from the census or surveys. And it was Francis who made the very important step from the LSMS to the PSLSD. Now, you might think, okay, the LSMS had it all set up and all you had to do was do an LSMS in South Africa, but that really wasn't true. It was my privilege to help advise on the project. I knew quite a lot about surveys from my own work, and actually I'd done some work for LSMS, but I knew very little about South Africa. And Francis was very much my teacher. I remember him looking at draft survey instruments from the World Bank that were taken from the LSMS, and him getting incredibly impatient with some of the officials from the bank who also knew nothing about South Africa, but they sometimes didn't know just how little they knew. And they were very keen, and this is important because it's been a long-term failing of the bank, which is they have templates and they think these templates work everywhere. And Francis knew that those templates didn't work anywhere. And he made it all happen. He brought in others with this incredible infectious enthusiasm the man had. And the survey really was his. He owned the survey with his amazing dedication and energy. The way I want to put this is, unlike many LSMS surveys, this was an inside job, meaning it was South African owned or Francis owned from the beginning. That was why it worked. Not an international template, but something that was really rooted in South African conditions, and which really couldn't have been done by pretty much anyone except Francis, who'd done the previous work, who'd been involved in this for so many years. In later years, Ann Case, with me occasionally in tow, was running surveys in Limpopo and KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape. He was a constant help, advisor, and friend, and often traveled with us. I remember a couple of unforgettable days collecting data in Power Town, a town that had everything in the way of poverty and deprivation. The only thing it didn't have at all was any power. One of the things we learned during that thing is just how affecting, how collecting data can be an intimate and even addictive experience. I mean, you wake up in the morning saying, I'm going to go out there and talk to more people. I'm going to find out more about their lives. And we loved it, and many of the people we were interviewing loved it too, that no one had really asked them these sort of things about their lives before. Later on, Francis also developed an arrangement with Princeton, and students from Princeton spent some time at UCT over a series of years. He regularly dined with Ann and I remember he always insisted very gleefully on bringing pudding, a term which is not widely used here in America, but which is very welcome in our house. And one tiny detail, Francis and Lindy have large pin boards covered with photographs in their house, a sort of tribute to their many friends and experiences over the years. And Ann and I were so struck by this, we imitated it. And in our kitchen, there was just a couple of large pin boards, and that imitation made Francis very happy when he came to visit. So I'm going to talk a bit more now about my main substance, the politics of numbers. And particularly, I'm really going to talk about poverty, though almost everything has implications for inequality. The other thing I'm going to do, which might disappoint some of you, is I'm going to talk mostly about the United States, though at the end I will move into a sort of wider focus. And I'm doing that simply because I know what happened here in a way that I don't know what happened in South Africa. But I hope that by the end, some of you who have been through what I've been through here will be able to talk about comparable things in South Africa. Poverty and inequality measures are things that we really care about because they involve justice in a way that GDP, for example, does not. You can sort of pretend that GDP is a technical issue, but no one thinks that poverty measure is entirely a technical issue. Now, that, of course, makes them subject to political interpretation and interference because people care about them. And discussing poverty and inequality measurement, not just the outcomes, tests the commitments of scientists, economists, anyone who's doing this to objectivity. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is just how good economists are at dealing with these issues. My profession is not currently particularly well regarded. We're often, in Joan Robinson's famous phrase, regarded as apologists for capitalism, that we've been captured. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And the question then is whether, we have undoubtedly technical and measurement skills, this sort of thing that Murray and Martin have developed splendidly over the years. But can we let those technical and measurement skills, are we capable of letting them overcome our political prejudices? Or put in Francis's words, Sorry, is there a problem? Okay. In Francis's words, do our minds on ice control our hearts on fire, or does the fire melt the ice? When I first came to Princeton, my colleagues David Card and Alan Kruger were working on the minimum wage, and James Buchanan, then Nobel laureate, still Nobel laureate, I guess, accused them of being a bevy of camp-following whores. He didn't like their finding that employment was insensitive to increases in the minimum wage. Perhaps he didn't like the implication that there are monopsonists who can exploit labor in the absence of other opportunity. And the exploitation of labor is not a term that before Card and Kruger had much in American economists' lexicon. Of course, in South Africa, exploitation was something that you knew about very well, as did Francis. So let me tell you this tortured story of poverty measurement in the US. It started with Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, and the War on Poverty he declared in 1964. If you have a war on poverty, you have to know whether you're winning or losing. And the Council of Economic Advisors, who are the main advisors to the president in the United States, needed an official poverty line. They, among themselves, what I call the water cooler line, they talked about it and they thought $3,000 a year for a family of four was about right as a poverty measurement. But they could hardly use that. They could hardly go in public and say that we just thought of this number. So, though, to be fair, if you take opinion polls like Gallup polls and you ask people what it is they think they would need, or a family of four would need to just get by, $3,000 a year was about what they came up with in 1964. Anyway, so the council commissioned a study by Molly Orshansky in 1963-4, a distinguished civil servant. And like many after her, and this is a recurring theme in poverty measurement, she looked at the cost of food, and she looked at the Department of Agricultural recommendations for what people should buy. So people in 1964 spent about a third of their total budget on food. So she took a recommended poverty plan from the Department of Agriculture, their low-cost food plan, and she multiplied it by 3 to get a poverty line. So when Molly reported back, the council said, we don't like that very much. It's a little too high. So she went back and looked at the economy plan instead of the low-cost plan, which was a cheaper plan. She multiplied that by 3, and she got about $3,000. Lo and behold, the number you first thought of. No one ever went through this exercise again. What they did was they just took Molly's line, the $3,000 a year, or at least better described as the water cooler line, and it was updated using the Consumer Price Index. So you've got this thing in 1964 or back to 1960, and it's just updated using Consumer Price Index to hold it fixed in real terms. I'd say this is less Orshansky than malarkey. It's sort of a fraud, because the stuff about the food is just window dressing. It's a cover. It appeals to the widespread sense among commentators that having enough to eat is the key to avoiding poverty. But we couldn't call it the water cooler poverty line. Of course, if it was right in 1960, which it might have been, who knows, it's wrong ever since, because the food share has gone down since, and the recommended bundle from the Department of Agriculture changes on a regular basis, along with all the food fashions and fads that come and go. Nevertheless, many people bought the derivation of the line and recommended changes based on updated food shares or food bundles. And indeed, if you look at the various poverty lines around the world, many of them were constructed in similar ways. So I guess you could say the malarkey worked. You could also argue, which I'm not quite sure what I think about, that poverty lines are arbitrary, at least within a range. Obviously, you can't have a poverty line that's in the top 1% and probably not in the bottom 1%, but there's a wide range in between where you can have it. So perhaps it really doesn't matter. Another reflection on this is the importance of science, or better, what Anne likes to call scientific, meaning, you know, you can't just have a water cooler number. You've got to justify it with some science, even if the science is malarkey. And many of us recently, during the COVID pandemic, have gotten used to people telling us to follow the science, even when the science was not particularly informative. There are a number of other problems with this line, however. In 1960, poor people didn't pay taxes, nor did they receive much in the way of benefits. So the resource base was family income, ignoring any benefits and taxes, which didn't really much matter to them. But what that meant when you held it was that government transfers to the poor could do nothing to lower poverty. Not because the transfers don't work, which people on the right like to claim, but because we're not counting them. So you give people a lot of money, it doesn't have any effect on their poverty status because we don't count those numbers. Now, we'll see about this in a minute. There are a number of lesser but potentially important issues. There's a lot of in-kind benefits, like health insurance, for instance, and how we value those as being the subject for much mischief. There's no variation in the CPI across a very large country or between rural and urban. The thresholds differed by family composition, but sometimes in very strange ways. They used to vary by the gender of the head of the household or by farm and non-farm. That was later removed. And despite the rhetoric, this line is an absolute line. It's not changing as social standards change. And many people like to talk about Adam Smith's wise lines about relative poverty. He said that, no one really needs a linen shirt. You could have something much cheaper. But in Scotland, you could not be respectable if you did not wear a linen shirt. He went on in a way that's not so often quoted, that shoes were a necessity for men to be respectable, women could wander around barefoot. And in France, which was not quite so advanced as Scotland, neither men nor women needed shoes to be respectable. And that's just a very good example of why you can't, in the long run, have an absolute poverty line which does not change as social standards change. There's another general message here, which is if you have an official measure like this, which has obvious flaws in it, which this one does, that invites all sorts of not just mischief, but beyond that, disasters. It makes it legitimate for others to step in because everyone knows this is a bad measurement. Everyone can say the official poverty measures are all screwed up. And that declares open season on alternatives, whether they're serious or not. So all people on all sides of the issue can come in with their politically, with their political judgments disguised as science. And in the end, that's what I'm going to argue really happened, is sort of destroyed the whole poverty measurement system here in the United States, even though there was serious debates within academia and in government agencies. There's a famous quote by Ronald Reagan in one of his State of the Union addresses that the federal government declared war on poverty and poverty won. People still love to quote that on the right, just claiming that all this government money we spend on poverty does nothing. Milton Friedman, typically, the government sets out to eliminate poverty. It has a war on poverty. So-called poverty increases, the suggestion that there is no such thing. It has a welfare program, and the welfare program leads to an expansion of problems. That's sort of very typical Chicago view. The government can do nothing to help people, not just poor people, anyone. And none of this is exactly right. There was quite a lot of progress, especially among the elderly and Blacks in early years, even using the official measure, but you can sort of see the point. This is not all ideology, though the ideology is there. Here's the latest numbers from the Census Bureau. The top graph gives the number of in millions of people in the US in poverty. Remember, about 350 million people in the US. And the bottom line is the one that you would usually quote about, which is the percentage of people who are in poverty. And what you can see here is that there was quite a lot of decline in the early years during the original war on poverty, down to maybe the mid-70s. And as with many other things in the United States, things started to go wrong after that. And you've got this sort of ups and downs, what Matt Desmond calls rolling hills, going on to today. And, the current line is about where it was in 1974. The current rate is about where it was in 1974, hardly a startling success. So there was a National Academy panel in 1995, which proposed a new set of measures. I was a member, also various other distinguished economists. These panels usually carry considerable weight. The Academy tries to politically balance them, whatever that means. The recommendations were never adopted, but it led to a supplementary poverty measure, which was widely ignored for a long time, but is now regularly published as a parallel series by the Census Bureau. And a lot of that happened because Rebecca Blank, who unfortunately died last year, became acting Secretary of Commerce in the Obama administration. And for reasons lost in the midst of time, the Commerce Department in the US is in charge of the census. A very nice example of how measurement is actually owned by business. That's worth bearing in mind. So in this alternative measure, the transfers and taxes count. There was also a relative measure, a small amount of relative, so that the line was drawn as food, shelter, clothing, and a little bit more. And that was updated annually to the median of the same expenditures in the general population. So it goes up over time as people spend more on those three items. Note, this does not make it an inequality measure. It's not relative to the median of total expenditure, just of this group of things which falls over time. There were also spatial price indices based on house prices across areas. This measure would require political approval, which has always been difficult or impossible. So here's recently what happened to the two measures. The official measure is the orange line. There's a little break in it there to do with surveys. Here's only from 2009, but through into the pandemic. And what you can see here is they track pretty well, except during the pandemic. And this is really, really important here because the US poured out an enormous amount of money during the pandemic to rescue people who'd lost their jobs and everything else. And that actually caused poverty to go down, according to the much better supplementary poverty measure. And the official one continued to rise because those things are not accounted in the official poverty measure. So this is surely a very good case for using the supplementary measure, certainly during exceptional times like COVID. Now, if we'd left things there, it might have been okay. But there's this sideways move at this point. And this is due to a battle between Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, courtesy of Alan Greenspan. And it's not about poverty, but about the consumer price index, something I think you're familiar with problems with in South Africa. And it was not consumer price index and poverty so much as social security, which is what our state pensions for the elderly are called in the United States, and which are indexed to the CPI. So economists of the Federal Reserve claimed that the CPI as measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics was rising too rapidly by more than 1% a year, a lot actually. And mostly there are a lot of minor reasons because it was ignoring improvements in the quality of goods. So what the argument was that prices might be rising, but at least some of that increase in price was being offset by the new goods were better. So the cost of living, which is the target of the CPI, was not rising as fast as the CPI. So people had lots of fun saying, well, now when you go to the bank, you don't have to stand in line, you go to the ATM, the cost of living's come down. Or would you rather go to a hospital of 1992 versus a hospital of 1960? So CPI index not only the official poverty line, but much else, especially Social Security. So the point is, if you could index Social Security to a number that was growing less rapidly, the adjusted CPI, that would save billions of dollars in federal expenditure and solve the budget impasse. And in fact, about a third of the federal budget in the US is linked to the consumer price index. And then you get Newt Gingrich, who's often thought of as the founder of modern adversarial American politics. He demanded the BLS fix it. And he has this wonderful, awful statement. We have a handful of bureaucrats who all professional economists agree have an error in their calculations. If they can't get it right the next 30 days or so, we zero them out, no budget. We transfer the responsibility to the Federal Reserve or the Treasury, and we tell them to get it right. Incidentally, the then commissioner of the BLS was Catherine Abraham, a very distinguished economist, current member of the National Academy of Sciences. The Senate Republicans set up a commission chaired by Michael Boskin to report. In the meantime, the budget battle was settled in other ways without cutting Social Security, which no one really wanted to do anyway. So the Boskin Commission confirmed the Fed's analysis, said the CPI was rising about 1% per year too fast. And, you know, if you read that report, it's pretty stunning how little of it is supported by hard empirical evidence. I'm sorry. Here's a quote. He says, fabrics are getting better over time. 0.33% a year is a conservative estimate. I agree, but not in the sense the commission meant. Boskin is Republican and was chosen because he was Republican, but he's moderate by today's standards. Other members, some of you may have heard of, Stig Griliches, Dale Jorgensen, both deceased now, and Bob Gordon. And there was a subsequent National Academy panel set up to examine Boskin's analysis and did not endorse it, nor did BLS make the suggested adjustment. So that hasn't stopped other people making that adjustment. So let me talk a little bit about quality, because quality is not a malarkey. It's not malarkey. It's just a mystery. So I don't want to be misunderstood in this. Quality is a real issue. Goods and services, many of them are getting better over time. And a simple example is gasoline. Suppose you have petrol or gasoline, and someone invents a new petrol which gives you twice as many miles per gallon as the old one did. So it's perfectly clear what the statistical service should do then, that the new gasoline is effectively where it costs half as much as the old gasoline, and that's the right thing to put in the price index. But the trouble is that lots of other goods are not like that. They're not simply repackageable as more quantity. One example that's been tossed around recently, flat screen televisions are better, but try having friends around to watch the World Cup on a 9-inch black and white television. You just can't do it. In many cases, old goods are no longer available or will no longer fulfill a social function. Adam Smith again, think of smartphones. You may have a hard time even living without a GPS on your car or a smartphone, or shopping without a car. I often give the example, I have 2 artificial hips, which were installed about 9 years apart. I need them both, even if the right one, which is newer, is better than the left one, which is older. I'm not sure it is, but people tell me that. But it's no good. You can't give me 1.5 hips. I need both of them in order to walk around. Life expectancy used to rise pretty regularly in the US. Is that a quality improvement? Is it anything to do with medical care, or is it something more generally? And it would seem very odd to reduce people's pensions because people are living longer. You need more money, not less. Boskin talked about reductions in crime. What about the improvements in defense? You know, there's no end of things like this, which arguably make life better, which reduce the cost of living because they substitute for things that you might otherwise have to buy. And the truth here, which is an uncomfortable truth for economists, we just don't know how to handle this. Price index and cost of living indices are not the same thing. And the gap here is not in measurement, but it's in theory. We do not have an economic theory of how to handle quality. And so that really gets in the way of doing measurement. Now, and this is important because some people would argue that we used to get better through having more of stuff, and now we get better mostly having better stuff. And that's possibly true. So now we're in a mess. The BLS makes quality corrections it thinks are well-based and could be defended. But some researchers deduct around 1% a year from the inflation rate. What that means is if you take Molly Orshansky's poverty line and you use this CPI that doesn't go up very rapidly, the corrected poverty line is lower than the official or even the supplementary poverty line. There are many fewer people beneath it, and more so over time. So Reagan's statement from the right saying Poverty 1, is now replaced by Trump's Chancellor economic advisor, which makes Reagan seem like a left-wing crazy man. Their statement is the war on poverty is largely over and is a success. They have poverty rates of like 1%. And the American safety net and the emphasis on work requirements, which is a huge thing among the right, that people are going to get benefits, they got to work for them. And they say there's no poverty in the US except for a few people whose self-defeating and self-limited behavior who brought their poverty on themselves. Familiar rhetoric, no. The right now has its own set of poverty measures for which they claim validation by respectable economists. Bruce Meyer, University of Chicago is one of them, backed by the American Enterprise Institute. Official and supplemental estimates do not agree, but they're both biased by not adjusting for quality according to the right. There are now emerging disagreements within the right, essentially over quality change once again, and again, no one really knows how to handle this. There are further disagreements about what to include. I could talk at great length about this, but a recent study is including the government health programs that are provided to people. They cost a huge amount of money because the costs of healthcare have been going up like a rocket, and people include those in what people have. I don't think it would be controversial to include something for those, but including the whole thing is too much. So there's lots of scope for mischief here. Now, let me back away from all these things altogether and talk about something that many of you here might find more sympathetic. And there's a wonderful book by Kathy Eden and Luke Schaefer called Living in America on $2 a Day in 2016. The $2 was to match the World Bank's absolute poverty line for global poverty around the world. And they went out there and lived with people and figured out what their lives were like. Doing the ethnography. The Mississippi Delta is particularly awful. One thing that struck me was women were selling their children's social security numbers, because if you're so poor, you can't take tax deductions for children. You can sell them to someone who's richer who can take the tax deduction by pretending those kids are theirs. One of the other things that came through again and again was women having to choose between a safe place to live and getting a job. And they were putting their kids at risk or not being able to work. And they estimated that about 2 million children were living in households with $2 per person per day or less. Matt Desmond wrote a famous book called Evicted, one of the few PhD theses I know that won a Pulitzer Prize. And what he documented again through ethnography, through living with people, was the day-to-day difficulties of finding a place to live, the endless struggle against eviction and exploitation. And he figured out just how profitable it is for many landlords and indeed for many companies to rent out to very, very poor people at the bottom of the income distribution, sort of extracting money from the very poorest. And his recent book this year called Poverty by America, Poverty Exists Because America Wants It That Way. The UN sent a special rapporteur, Philip Alston, who was invited by Obama, and documented throughout the United States people living with dangerous water, yards awash in untreated sewage, mass homelessness in some cities, especially Los Angeles. He documented how local authorities in many towns, the police use fines and confiscations from poor people to run the police department, and how heavy a racial dimension to almost all of this. For those of you who know what life is like on the ground in South Africa, these studies will seem very familiar to you, and they're worth knowing about just to know that the most awful poverty in the world exists in South Africa. Sorry, we know it exists in South Africa, it exists in America in a way that is perhaps not very different from the worst poverty around the world. Now, there's a lot of pushback on these surveys. People claim that benefits are missed in the surveys. There are lots of valuation issues. So the question is, if you get these things in kind, you can't really pay your rent with them. Nikki Haley, who's currently running for president and who was then the US ambassador to the UN, denounced the Alston report, said it is patently ridiculous for the United Nations to examine poverty in America. This is this myth. There may be poor people in Africa and Asia, but we don't really have them here. She said, we know how to get rid of poverty. We make people work. I'm sure that's worked for some, but not all the poor can work, and it widens inequality among the poor. But nevertheless, today in America, work requirements for benefits are currently a very hot political issue. Let me come now to comparing the US with countries in Africa and Asia. So Bob Allen wrote a wonderful piece in the American Economic Review showing that the PPP, the purchasing power parity corrections for prices across countries don't really work for rich versus poor countries, simply because they only capture prices and they don't capture the fact that you need more quantities in some countries. So you might be able to buy enough food for $2 a day in the US, but you can't get shelter. You can't buy clothing. Those things, you need more of them and they're very expensive. So when you do that, make that correction, it turns out the poverty rate in the US and China are similar. That's the rate. There are more globally poor people in the US than in Sierra Leone or Nepal. I argued this in a piece in the New York Times, and I was the rage from both right and left. I'm sure I would have been canceled if I used social media, but I don't. And both the right and the left in the US have to believe that there is no global poverty in America. The left, because it's defending foreign aid and it doesn't want to detract from America giving money to poor countries in the world. The right doesn't want there to be any poverty in America because it doesn't want to have to pay taxes to get people out of poverty. The eminent writer Paul Theroux wrote a book called Deep South, in which he traveled around the southern United States. And he argued that in many places in the US South were much, much poorer than many of the places he knew well in Africa. And he's lived in a lot of African countries, taught there, traveled there, written books about it. He in particular excoriated the Clinton Foundation for not doing anything for workers or poor people in their home state of Arkansas, and noted that this is a broad phenomenon. It's much easier for rich Americans to admit to global poverty, which is safely not at home, but to refuse to acknowledge their role in poverty in the US. For anyone who's been to Davos, you'll know this is how it works at Davos. These people come here to pay penance. They go to the Oxfam tent, they bemoan global poverty, but they're never reminded of the fact that they may have something to do with poverty at home. As Theroux puts it, African elephants are safer targets for sympathy than are workers in America. So maybe we should look to other countries who are doing better. Well, we have a real problem here too. The Modi government has suppressed the most recent 2017-18 round of the household survey on which official estimates of poverty were based. In India, they have poverty last, data last, not data first. So the last survey-based evidence on poverty, which is how poverty has been calculated in India, is from more than 10 years ago, from 2011, 2012. There's many suspicions that perhaps the results on the recent round were not as good as Modi thought they ought to be. And of course, he's got this very rapid growth of national income, about which there are also deep suspicions. And the right in India and in the US, commenting on Indian poverty, has extrapolated from GDP growth, just said if GDP is growing very fast, then poor people are getting rich very fast and poverty is going away. That's an old fight. It was wrong in the past and it's wrong now. Now, this is not just a problem for India, but it's a problem for the World Bank that's trying to estimate global poverty. About a quarter of the world's poor live in India. So the bank took a marketing survey in which the poor were severely underrepresented. Marketers don't much care about poor people because they don't spend much. And they based their recent most global estimates on this corrected marketing survey, but there's been work by Jean Drèze and others showing this doesn't work. So we've got a global poverty measurement is thus severely compromised too. So the hearts on fire have taken over. They've screwed up domestic policy poverty measurement and they've screwed up world poverty measurement. We don't know anymore. So a few thoughts as I come to the end about my own profession. There are some economists whose results cannot be predicted from their political convictions, though sometimes they seem to be few and far between. The idea that government cannot help the poor, which was hammered by Chicago, is an old one. Albert Hirschman wrote a wonderful book called The Rhetoric of Reaction and traced it back to the Enlightenment, that if you try to help the victims, you only hurt them. There are people on both sides of these debates who are technically competent and make serious points that need to be listened to, as well as some whose analysis clearly rigged. The non-political government agencies, at least in the US, have performed pretty well, but they're also limited in power and they're headed up by political appointees. There's also serious data problems here. Documenting distress is technically difficult because the distress gets in the way. The people are living in difficult environments. Collecting data about them is not always easy. Many poor communities are plagued by violence. It makes it very difficult to collect data. The ethnographic work is incredibly important, as it's been throughout history of poverty measurement. I mean, if you go back into think of Engels in England and Manchester during the Industrial Revolution, they documented the living standards of the poorest people in England, and that had huge political effects. It's incredibly important, and it still is. What it has difficulty with is documenting the extent of the problem. I mean, you can find these horrible things going on, but we don't know how widespread they are. And it's hard for Matt Desmond, Kathy Eden, or Luke Schaefer to match what they see to what the data appear to see. So maybe, this is my last slide, there are alternative approaches. And these are not alternative approaches that find different ways of measuring poverty, material poverty, as we think about it. But they measure different things which are relevant for thinking about the living standards of poor people. The philosopher Gordon Graham argues that we should focus on impoverishment, not poverty. There are many poor people who live very good lives. And echoing Shannon Nussbaum's capability approach, he argues that what is important are three vital things, which are achievements, experiences, and relationships. And our individualistic approach in economics tends to ignore the last. But in many ways, it's the breakdown in relationships that are harming people in the US today, not just for the poor, but for the working class, many of whom, or some of whom at least, are newly impoverished by the deindustrialization of many American towns. This would take us in a direction that's much more like Durkheim rather than individualistic economics, let alone libertarian economics, that it's the social supports that people need to make their lives worth living. So Ann Case and our work has been working on mortality very heavily. Mortality is not a substitute for poverty measurement. It's really a different thing. But in these debates where the right is saying, the poor people, everyone in America is really doing so well, then we ask the question of why are they dying in droves? Why are they killing themselves through suicide, drugs, and alcohol? And on that despairing note, I will stop talking and open up for questions, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And will somebody take the mic? Let's take 10 to 15 minutes or so of questions. Let's start with a few in the room, and then we'll turn to those online. Right up the front here.
I'm not hearing anything, so you may have to translate.
Hello.
Cool.
Okay, excuse me, can you hear me? Yes. Hello. Okay, can you hear me now or still not? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes?
Great.
No? Okay. Can you hear me, sir? Oh God. Okay. So should I just come to the front because I'm in the front row? Hold on. Okay.
Yeah, other question?
No, I didn't hear that at all. I've heard nothing.
There you go. Hello. Thank you so much for your lecture. It was really, really fascinating. I'm a student in economics, and I was just wondering, you talked about ethnography and like how it can be helpful to understanding poverty better and how it often doesn't match the data. But could you tell us a little bit more about what economists specifically can do to help governments combat poverty? Like, what are the things that specifically economists can do in this respect with all the kind of debate that's going on in the left and the right? Is there an objective help that can be given by economists?
I think objective is perhaps too high a standard.
Hang on.
Sorry, we can't hear you yet.
Hello?
Now we can, yeah.
I think objective is perhaps a little too high to ask for. It's not that the ethnographers can't match what you see in the data. It's just that the ethnographers, what they see is real, and they see horrible things. The question is, how widespread is that? And, you know, if they're just going to a few really bad places and say, well, we know in that hellhole things are really bad, but that's not typical of what's happening in America. And we need to do that. So one of the things on the measurement side, which takes me back to DataFirst and to Francis and all the rest of it, is we need to have surveys that reach down reliably to those levels so that we can actually try to do a better job of matching up what's going on with the ethnographers and what we see in the data. And some of that can be done with better administrative data, because administrative data often go places where the surveys can't easily go. I haven't really talked about policies here, but there's a wide range of policies, including, you know, child benefits, for example, which are sometimes much easier to sell politically than you know, benefits that go to everybody. I'm not much in favor of something that I know has been much discussed in South Africa, which is universal basic income. I think the targeting tends to work better than that. And, you know, I think we have some pretty good idea of things that do work. But unless we can solve the measurement problem, we're never going to persuade people that these things are working.
Thank you so much.
If I speak really loudly, will you be able to hear me?
Yeah, I can hear that. Speak really loudly. Go for it.
Say that. I'm unofficially here from the public sector. And one of the most sobering encounters I had was with people who work in the informal sector, where I was pushing digital data collection and data quality, telling me that there's more they need to do, there's safety they have to preserve, and the violence means they just do what they can and get out. And that's a provocation, because what I want to know is what you think the public sector's role is in knowing something about who's where, not just what's there, in order to develop policies and strategies to solve some of those concerns in space, where I think lots of governments don't like to pay too much attention about who you find there, rather than what infrastructure might solve a poverty problem.
I got some of that. I'm sorry, I could hear the noise, but I mean, this question of who rather than what, I think is certainly very, very important. And, you know, I haven't talked about trying to understand things here. And trying to understand things, the who thing is obviously absolutely central. I mean, who are the people who are suffering? And then that takes you into why are they suffering? And it's not just sort of a blanket thing. It's not a real surprise that in the US, that so much distress is in the South. And there's so much distress in the South because that's where America's Black populations live in large numbers, and where in many states the politics is the control of a white conservative polity that clearly doesn't want to do anything but that. So if you look at the structure of welfare benefits, you know, the poverty lines, the amount of welfare and so on is very much lower in places where there are large Black populations than there are in places where they're not. And the history of America is that, you know, people don't really like to pay for benefits that reach people who look differently from them. Now, your situation in South Africa is different, but the who, of course, is absolutely central to all of this.
Can I talk?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to.
There's another question.
Oh, one more question? Yeah, please. This will be the last one.
Evening, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, your mic was killed, so you're no longer audible.
Okay, thank you. Evening, sir. We often underestimate the role that luck has to play in shaping one's financial success. It is indeed the case in many parts of the world that certain affluent individuals are the beneficiaries of being born at the right place and at the right time. And I'm excluding people who are trust fund babies, people who have inherited large sums of money. Simply, certain people tend to stumble upon a grand stroke of luck that pushes them onto a path of acquiring a success and another success in sort of an iterative streak that kind of gives them an advantage over everyone else. And so how would we account for this, and how would we kind of rectify you know, the role that something as external as luck had to play in you know, helping these individuals acquire their wealth? Yeah,
That's one of my favorite themes you struck on there. I think it's incredibly important. It's not just that there are people who are born with silver spoons in their mouths and people who don't have anything of the sort. It's that luck comes all through life in different points. So two things is, one is keep talking about it, because it's incredibly important for people to understand. The people who are successful tend to think it was, or not all of them, but there's a natural belief that people who are successful got there by their own efforts. And so they sort of feel that poor people, if they'd worked as hard as I worked, then they would be fine. And so we don't really have to worry about this. It's sort of blaming the poor. And no doubt there are people who make bad decisions in their lives and who, you know, have to live with the consequences. But the role of luck in rich people succeeding tends to be terribly underestimated, and it's really, really important. But there's another set of issues that are very important here. A lot of people on the right like to say, if we have equality of opportunity, we don't have to worry about inequality of outcomes, right? And that ignores luck too, because, you know, if we all start on a level playing field, some of us get lucky and some of us don't. And so there's a lot of what the philosophers call brute luck going on, which is not your responsibility. And even if it is at least part your responsibility, not everybody who smokes gets lung cancer or gets heart disease. So, you know, we should deprive people who smoke of treatment? I don't think so. So you can't really, the equality of opportunity, even if it's laudable, is certainly not enough. We've got to actually deal with material inequality as it exists, and we've got to understand that luck plays a big part of it. You can actually see that in the data, because if you track people over time, they become more and more unequal over time. And that's largely the effects of luck. Some people, it happens in casinos where, it's not really skill, it's just the spin of the wheel. And that's a lot of what we're looking at. It should promote solidarity, which is another very important thing the right doesn't like, between those of us who've done well and those of us who have not done so well. So thanks for the question. It's a really, really important topic.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go.
Good. Thank you very much, Sir Angus, and thank you very much to the questioners as well. I'd like to invite Professor Martin Wittenberg, who is the Director of DataFirst, to deliver a vote of thanks. Martin, thank you.
We're not going to take any online questions. We don't have the time.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was a awe-inspiring lecture. We were very privileged to have a lecture of this caliber. One of the things that, if one looks at the legacy of Francis, there are really kind of four key ideas in there that I think are important. It's the one is the paying attention to data. So it's the looking for data, bolstering arguments with data. The second thing, which hasn't been discussed today, is actually training. I mean, he was very clear right from the beginning when the 1993 survey was run that South Africans needed to have the capacity to analyze their own data. So he negotiated with the World Bank that part of their support was also going to be training for South Africans to acquire the skills. The third, of course, is basically combining the skills with the data to produce insightful analysis about real problems and issues. It's the applied focus, it's the moral focus, as it were, that underpins that, which you've also spoken about. And then the fourth, which I think is also really important, is the transparency issue. So basically, Francis insisted that the data from that 1993 survey be released immediately before he had, sort of had a chance to kind of write his 10 papers based on the data. It was put into the public domain as fast as possible, also to assure the incoming government that the data hadn't been fiddled with, that actually, in a way, here's the data, make of it what you will. Now, the reason why we're actually really lucky to have had Angus give this lecture is that Angus also represents all of those things. And for that, I'm very thankful. So there's a whole generation of South African economists who grew up on that 1993 PSLSD data sets. So Murray's already mentioned himself. That was the data set on which I cut my teeth, Dory Posel, and so it goes on. So basically, South African applied microeconomists, I think if you look around the country of my generation and slightly younger, we've all been influenced by that data set. We've been influenced by the analyses that you and Ann Case have used that data for. So basically the arguments that he produced on the old age pension, the papers, it was absolutely stunning that we as South Africans were startled how much information there was in the data that we didn't see ourselves. So in a sense, it took you and Ann to show us what a gold mine we were sitting on in our own data. And that learning experience is actually really important. Engaging with you and with Ann was important in building capacity in South Africa. And for that, we will be eternally grateful. And then the book that you published on analysis of household surveys actually showed how you combine data with theory, with transparent code. It's the code at the back of that book, which a lot of us also learned from long before the rest of the profession caught up to the idea that you should actually release your code with the analysis. And again, for that, we are very grateful. And I think that what your talk today really brought home again is how the work that we do, in a sense, whether it's in South Africa or elsewhere, I mean, we're actually grappling with similar kinds of issues. We have a lot to learn from this international community, and it was a pleasure to have been part of that pathway here, and we are very, very grateful that you gave this lecture and for all that you've done for South African economists. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin. So in addition to the memorial lecture, we have the Francis Wilson Prize, and I'd like to invite Professor Taryn Dinkelman to come and tell us about the prize and the awardee. Taryn, thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Taryn Dinkelman. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Notre Dame. I'm incredibly honored that Martin Wittenberg asked me to chair the panel of international adjudicators for the first annual Francis Wilson Memorial Prize for Data-Driven Research. I sat on a panel with Professor David Lamb, who's emeritus now at the University of Michigan, and Professor Susie Godlington, who's at Williams College. And we were very happy to look at the 20 or so papers that were submitted for 2 prize categories. So tonight, I want to say a few remarks about the prize, and then I will announce each of the winners in the 2 categories. The first category was for the best chapter from a student dissertation, either a master's or a PhD dissertation, completed in the last 2 years, I believe. The second category of prize is for the best article published in a peer-reviewed journal in the last 2 years. So a key criteria for eligibility was that submissions needed to use publicly available data from DataFirst's open data portal and correctly attribute that data in the article or in the dissertation. That was really a key part of what this prize is trying to encourage researchers to do more, and a practice that we hope more people will begin to adopt: correct attribution of data and open data sources as papers make their way through the journal process. So papers from any quantitative social science discipline were eligible for entry. And we saw entries from economics, from public health, and from geography. And in addition to the specific eligibility criteria, we were looking for some really important aspects of the papers that made strong submissions. So firstly, we were looking for submissions that addressed questions of broad general interest on topics that were connected to important social challenges. And then secondly, we wanted to look for innovative use of public data sources. And both of the winners tonight meet these stringent criteria. So the first award that I would like to announce, and what I'll do is I'll say a few words about each paper, and then I'll ask the winners to come forward, and we'll have Lindy Wilson present them with the plaque and the prize. Our first award is for the best student dissertation, and it goes to Dr. Rivka Rumani for her PhD work in public health, which was completed at the University of the Western Cape and submitted, I believe, just a few months ago in December 2022. The title of the chapter she submitted was Inequality in the Distribution of Non-Communicable Disease Multimorbidity in Adults in South Africa. In this chapter, Rivka uses the 2017 NIDS data, so that's the National Income Dynamics survey data, to examine the relationship between wealth quintile and multimorbidity, which is basically when an individual is living with more than one chronic disease, so diabetes and hypertension, for example. So what she does is she uses the national survey to document that about 3% of the NIDS adult sample suffers from multiple morbidities. And a really surprising finding from her chapter was that this multimorbidity prevalence was most prevalent among the top income quintiles. And her hypothesis is that this is because wealthier people have actually more access to health insurance, to private health insurance, and that some of those private health insurance screenings that are so people are forced to take, or what is revealing this multimorbidity, these multiple chronic diseases. So one implication of this result, I think, is that there's likely very much undiagnosed morbidity among lower income quintiles, the poorest wealth quintiles in South Africa. And given the important discussions that are being had now recently about the introduction of the NHI, I think these patterns are going to be really, really important to track going forward in time in South Africa. So the full title of Rivka's PhD dissertation is The Burden of Multimorbidity in South Africa, Implications for Health Policy and Service Delivery. I should say that Dr. Rumini is already an extremely productive junior scholar. She's produced 10 peer-reviewed journal publications from her PhD alone, and she's currently a senior scientist at the South African Medical Research Council. So we can give you a congratulatory clap now. We'll do it again at the end when I ask you to come up. So that was for the best student dissertation. The second category of prize, as I mentioned, was for the best article published in a peer-reviewed journal in the last 2 years. And for this prize, Professor Vimal Ranchad is awarded the best article prize for his paper co-authored with Miguel Pellicer. And the title of the paper is Understanding the Effects of Racial Classification in Apartheid South Africa. This paper was accepted for publication in the Journal of Development Economics, which is the top-ranked field journal in development economics. Most of you know that Vimal is a professor here in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town and the deputy director at SALDRU, so that's a double win for UCT. I want to say a few words about the paper because I think it highlights a lot of the things that we're looking for in highlighting this prize. So Vimal and Miguel's paper addresses a very broad and important question in economics about the effects of legal discrimination on the effects of legal discrimination for and against certain groups on the individuals' labor market outcomes. So think about employment, think about income and wealth. So they use the context of apartheid South Africa, and they estimate the causal effect of being classified as white relative to being classified as colored on incomes and on other labor market outcomes. So this is actually a really difficult problem to address econometrically and a really important problem to try and answer. And so the piece that we really appreciated was their very creative use of the history together with the publicly available data to address this question. So the 1950 Population Registration Act in South Africa was a key piece of legislation that required all South Africans to be registered and assigned to an official racial category. And what the authors do is they cleverly exploit a change in policy that privileged ancestry over appearance in the process of racial classification for certain cohorts born later than 1951. What they do is they pull together publicly available census data from 1980, from 1991, 1996, and they show that as a result of this policy change, you can actually see a jump, a discontinuity in the share of people who are classified as white relative to colored after this policy change relative to before. Basically, there's a smaller share of people who are classified as white relative to colored in those later age groups. Then what they do is they show that actually income changes exactly at this discontinuity as well. And they attribute these changes in outcomes to the changes in racial shares through the discontinuity. So that's a little bit of technical stuff, but the key finding, the key takeaway, and I think the importance of this paper is in showing that being classified as white resulted in a more than 4-fold increase in incomes for men, or over 90% of the difference in average incomes between men across white and colored population groups. 3 aspects of the paper really made it the clear winner for us in this category. First, it addresses a really important and difficult question about the impacts of legislated discrimination in South Africa and more generally, discrimination on individual means of acquiring wealth. Secondly, it leverages a deep understanding of the historical context to develop an appropriate empirical strategy for causal analysis. And third, it was a very creative implementation of research design using all of the available public access data. Overall, our assessment was that Francis Wilson would have been very interested in, very appreciative of this work. So congratulations, Fimmel. So I'd like to invite Lindy Wilson up and Dr. Rumney and Professor Anshad, if you want to make your way up here. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you so much. My gosh, so soon. Wow, fantastic. It sounds so confident. Thank you. Let me know what you've done. Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. I just hi, Angus. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Lindy. It's so good to see you.
Angus, thank you. I can't thank you enough for immediately saying yes to give this fabulous lecture in memory of Francis. And it was extremely interesting, and we've got tons to think about. I actually wasn't told that I had to make remarks this evening until I walked into the room. And I have to say that I'm not Francis Wilson, who can ad-lib anything in any moment in time. But today's been a bit of an overwhelming day, actually, because I think Francis would be amazed at everything, and all of you, and there are many familiar faces in the audience. And first of all, you know, this book, Black, White, and Gold, which Molesi Mbeki has published today, is a whole, Francis actually did it at the end of his life. He put it together with a wonderful student called Samantha Culligan, who I would like to thank, although I don't think she's here. And now to have the memorial lecture that DataFirst has implemented. I'm really, he'd be so honored. I mean, he almost might be embarrassed and quite shy about it all, actually. But SALDRU has gone from strength to strength to strength since Francis began it in the 70s. And I've known it from scratch, actually, and a whole lot of stuff and everything that went into it and all of everything. So I just want to say thank you all very, very much. And SALDRU and DataFirst, you sound, I mean, look, it sounds like everything is absolutely on track. Francis is probably listening to us all. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Lindy. We've come almost to the end of the formal part of the program. I'd like to invite Mary Leibran to make some closing remarks. Mary, thank you.
Yes, thank you. A very special evening, Angus, and you've made it that way. So Angus was going to come and deliver the lecture, and then it just wasn't possible for him to do so. And his own judgment was, okay, but we need to have a party for Francis. So you need to find somebody else to give the lecture because I can't come to have a party for Francis. Well, we decided otherwise. There just wasn't a better person to deliver the lecture. And Angus, you've given us a party for Francis in the best balanced way possible. and we will still retire to have a few drinks and things around the corner, inspired by what's happened today. So thank you very, very much. I just want to close by saying a few things about Lindy, actually. So at the book launch today, so this was a book that Francis had on his heart in his final years. He felt deeply that there was a lot of work that was being left on the not publicly available, not collated. That was, he wanted to be out there for himself. So he pushed hard on this book project. And at the end of the day, and all the way through his life, there was a co-author not written on the text of all of Francis's work, and that was Lindy Wilson, guiding him through. Jeff Budlander was talking today about the hard walk as you navigate, and it's partly what Angus was saying tonight as well. You don't belong to any camp. You belong to what you believe in, and you gather data and you see what it's telling you, and you navigate a walk. And in South Africa, over its history, that's never been an easy needle to thread. And Francis found it very stressful. And he acknowledged to us in SALDRU that that's a difficult walk. The chosen way is a difficult walk, and he wouldn't have made it without Lindy. And in the final book project, he wasn't quite capable of finishing the book, finishing the project. And really, in honor of Francis, Lindy and the team, Samantha, Culligan, Pippa, others, closed out the book project. And so today it was a fantastic way to honor Francis with the publication of this book and then this amazing lecture. So thank you all very much. And thank you especially to all the people online as well, the many hundreds of people online for today's meeting. This is a contemporary Francis Wilson Memorial Lecture, and even the technological failures, right? So Martin and I went big on market-based solutions to make sure everything was perfect. So whatever, that's the luck in all of us. Anyway, so thank you very much for a wonderful evening. Thank you, Angus. Thank you, everybody.